Hello, I'm Brendan Anderson, and we're here at Bachrock Elementary School here in San Jose for Follow Your Bliss, sponsored by the 49ers EDU. They're here giving back to the community and to schools in the neighboring areas. What a great event today. We got to have Dr. Harry Edwards, the renowned Dr. Harry Edwards, speak to fifth graders from Bachrock Elementary.
Officer-involved shootings in the Bay Area. This is as old as the post-World War II civil rights movement. These issues have not been resolved. We can't continue just kicking them down the road and saying justifiable homicide. We have got to look at this because it is literally tearing this nation apart. I think that these young people are ready to look at all gun violence, including violence carried out under cover of the badge. Not just school violence, but violence that's happening in some of these at-risk communities where we have children killing children. Anytime you have violence at this level that is involving police officers, children killing children, people being killed in churches and schools, in offices and businesses and so forth, you have a problem that you have to deal with. And I think that these young people are the generation to do it. It's an old problem. What happened in Sacramento, they just let somebody go in Baton Rouge who killed the young man who was on the ground with his hands behind his back. We have got to come to grips with this. We've got to face this. We've got to deal with it. This is something that we, the people, have got to finally resolve. You're talking about somebody who's on a much higher pay scale than I am, and that's not something that they have, that the team or the league has consulted with me about beyond asking me my opinion and for input in terms of the trajectory and so forth of these protests going forward in an era of protest. They're not going to be able to separate the athletes out from what's happening with the young people and the anti-violence gun movement and the Me Too movement and so forth. They're not going to be able to isolate athletes from that. My job has been to try to define and create a reasoned and rational discourse about how we're going to manage that. In terms of the specific signings of specific athletes, I haven't been consulted about that. Well, the first time that Cap took a knee during the preseason game, the first thing I did when I went into the locker room was to gather up from him his jersey and his shoes and get him an autograph and turn everything over to the Smithsonian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I told them at the time to put them right next to Ali's because that's going to be the impact of what he was doing even at that time. You didn't have to be Nostradamus to see the trajectory of things and developments. And the challenge that this whole athlete activism movement is confronted with today is that there's a great chance, a very good chance, that the movement will be overwhelmed by broader movements that are targeting the same kinds of concerns. I think that the Me Too movement and what women are doing, especially with the midterm elections coming up and some of the issues that are involved there, along with the movement that these young students have started against gun violence overall, is going to make what the athletes are doing of cast a much smaller shadow unless they can figure a way to join with and to collaborate collaborate with these larger movements, which is what I'm looking at now to see what evidence there is that we're going to move beyond the Kaepernick era and really begin to look at broader associations and collaborations in terms of some of these broader issues. They're concerned about gun violence and police violence in minority communities in particular, but they're going to have to bring that together with what these kids are doing out of Florida, what happened in D.C., and most particularly with this Me Too movement and violence and abuse of women and girls. And if they don't do that, then they're going to recede into the background, and there'll be a fifth wave of athlete activism that will come along and will do that.
In the 60s and 70s, you and other athletes brought a voice to issues in the country. The 80s and 90s, a lot of athletes were silent. Do you feel there's a responsibility for athletes with that?
Well, we in the 1960s, we were part of a movement that was defined by a broader civil rights movement, and more specifically the Black Power movement. In the 1980s and 90s, the civil rights movement was essentially in decline. The Black Power movement was history. There was no defining ideological disposition that was framing up what was going on at that time, and in point of fact, people were in a state of movement fatigue, and so it was possible for athletes who were high profile to make statements like, "I'm not a role model," to make statements like, "Republicans buy gym shoes too," and literally suffer no consequences of it, because there was no movement, there was no ideological framing that would put that in perspective. It was not until we got well into the second decade of the 21st century with the Black Lives Matter movement that all of a sudden this thing became framed up again, and that's when Kaepernick took a knee. That's how I knew, after the first time he took a knee, to go in, get his shoes, get his jersey, get his stuff autographed, and get it to the Smithsonian, because this is the trajectory that things are going to take. So looking at where we are now, if the athlete activist of this fourth wave era, which is the Kaepernick and LeBron James and D. Wade and Maya Moore and Tina Charles and so forth, Mike Bennett and Malcolm Jenkins, if they do not figure a way to link up with the movements that are now framing up the trajectory of social protests, then they will recede into the background until other activist athletes figure a way that they can align themselves with these new ideological perspectives and activist definitions. And to date, I still see people functioning rather narrowly, because their focus is really not activism. Their focus is athletic achievement, and it takes a major effort for them to move beyond where they are. Some athletes probably will align themselves with these young students and with these women going forward, but that would constitute a fifth wave of athlete activism separate from what Kaepernick and these athletes are doing today.
Thank you for joining me today. We'll see you next time.